Thank you very much. We've had a bit of attrition in the audience, but very little. So I'd like to thank you for your endurance. I'm an academic, and I have to say that people in academic conferences, they usually show a lot less stamina than the audience has demonstrated today. So I hope we'll make it worth your while. The format that I'm going to stick to with the panel is that we'll have all of the 4 speeches first. We will then have a collective Q&A from the audience after all 4 presentations. And in between, we'll wedge the 2 questions with your little voting gadgets. But if there are any immediate reactions to the presentations from people on the panel, then we can definitely accommodate that. But I think we should not open the floor before we've run through all of the presentations. And I'll try to hold my horses because state-owned enterprise is a topic that I care about deeply and that I've done a lot of research about in the Middle East region, in the GCC countries in particular. But the only thing I want to do at the outset is throw out a few interesting numbers and some provocative hypotheses regarding the applicability or perhaps the non-applicability of some of the conventional OECD or Western governance rules to the state-owned entities in the MENA region. So here is the result of a very interesting poll that only came out 3 days ago. It was a poll conducted by Ernst & Young about the feeling of the public in different countries about state-owned enterprises. It was conducted with 12,000 respondents in 24 different countries, and the one big Gulf country that was included in the poll, unfortunately the others weren't, was Saudi Arabia. And here's one of the questions that was asked in the poll. It is in the country's best interest if big industries are controlled by the government. And then people could agree, strongly agree, disagree, or be neutral about it. And among the 24 countries, the one country with the highest share of people in agreement was Saudi Arabia. And other countries with high agreement were Russia and China. And there we have a more plausible, intuitive explanation why that is the case. In Russia, we've had robber baron capitalism of oligarchs essentially stealing state assets in the 1990s. So, of course, the public would want some of that to be clawed back and brought back into state control. China has a long socialist history, a long history of state-led development. Now, Saudi Arabia is a less obvious case to expect that kind of response, certainly on that level. Because it is a country with a long history of free enterprise. It is also an oil-rich country, and the conventional wisdom is that in oil-rich countries, bureaucracies tend to function less well. The public sector tends to be more bloated than in other countries. So it is really, really interesting that the Saudi public puts such enormous stock in the public control of state-owned enterprises. And you will not be surprised if I tell you that actually that result did not come as a surprise to myself, knowing the public sector in the GCC quite closely and having researched some of these entities like SABIC or Ramco quite closely. And if we could go to the next slide, there is actually, contrary to expectations, there is a history of very, very successful state-owned enterprise management in at least the GCC countries that have been consistently profitable throughout oil boom as well as oil bust periods. We have here profit figures for some of the major successful Gulf state-owned enterprises, and there are national champions like Etisalat or Emirates Airlines, like SABIC, as mentioned, in the field of heavy industry in Saudi Arabia, Alba, the aluminum smelter in Bahrain, that are really peerless, at least in the universe of oil-rich, of resource-rich countries. And that's a puzzle that needs explanation, and it's, in policy terms, it's a track record that is very important, I think, to look at for other countries in the region, including other countries that are resource-rich. Because if we go to the next slide, in general, the kind of conventional wisdom that public enterprises tend to be loss-making is true. It is something that by and large applies historically to a lot of the region, also to the developing world in general. And arguably the Middle East is the country where you have the largest, the most striking contrast between those successful cases and a broader public sector in general, also in the GCC, where you've had enormous losses and white elephants. And that just gives you a sense of how high the stakes are and the size of the contrast between success and failure really underlines how important it is to look at how the successful cases have been organized. And in that context, it's interesting to look at some of the OECD or other international standards in corporate governance and see that some of them seem to have been applied in the successful cases, but others seem to really have been pretty much ignored with no apparent damage done. We talked about boards today. How independent should they be? How competent should they be? And I could tell you stories of some very successful state-owned enterprises where the boards have been neither very independent nor very competent, and still those enterprises have been very successful. And one of the things, and I'll close here, one of the things that I would like to see some discussion about in the course of the panel is to which extent the kind of general rules about disclosure, auditing, governance, and ownership structures, all those kinds of standard rules that are very nicely laid out in the OECD guidelines, to which extent they're applicable in the Middle East context, and to which extent perhaps other informal political institutional structures have been more important in explaining the success of specific state-owned entities. And I've been going on for too long already, and without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, who is an old friend of Hawkamah and the OECD. It's Dr. Ashraf Gamal, who is the Executive Director of the Egyptian Institute of Directors. Please, Ashraf.
This must be my lucky day, actually. I mean, twice in the same day, I'm the first speaker in a session. So thank you, Hawkamah. Just to give you a very quick introduction, the key developments in corporate governance in Egypt in one slide exactly. Now, the first time we talked about corporate governance in Egypt was 10 years ago, in 2000, after the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. We started introducing the concept in Egypt. 2001, we invited the World Bank to evaluate our corporate governance, and they gave us plenty of recommendations then. 2001 and 2, capital market laws were started to be adjusted, listing requirements and so on, to try to accommodate some of the recommendations by the World Bank ROSC report. 2003, and again in response to the recommendation, we established the Egyptian Institute of Directors. That was then headed by one of our colleagues, my colleagues actually. 2004, we invited the World Bank again to evaluate our corporate governance structure. They gave us some more recommendations and they praised what was going on. In 2005, it was the first time where we issued the Code of Corporate Governance for listed companies in the Arabic language based on the OECD principles. 2006, we launched the Egyptian Code of Corporate Governance for state-owned enterprises, again based on the OECD principles. 2007, we launched the Egyptian Audit Committee Manual, and in 2008, we established a specialized center in CSR under the umbrella of the Institute of Directors. Last year, we invited the ROSC, the World Bank, again to evaluate our framework. We thought we are there. They gave us again more and more recommendations. This year, we launched the Egyptian Index of Corporate Social Responsibility and Corporate Governance, as I talked about in the first session. Now, why do we care about corporate governance in Egypt? Again, this continuation of what you have started. Number one, they are some of the biggest companies in Egypt are state-owned enterprises, so we cannot really ignore them. We have massive investments, a large amount of labor force in these companies. And I have to say that when these companies are not well governed, they create market distortions. So it's not only the impact, the negative impact is on them, but actually on the markets in which they are operating. So the damage is beyond the borders of the SOEs to the entire economy in that respect. Again, it is important so that you minimize the advantages which are given to these companies at the expense of the society, and to improve their reputation, credibility, and also to make them easier for privatization later on. Now, the first thing that Egypt did in the area of governance of SOEs was launching a law for these companies, and that was Law 203 in 1991. Now, some people call this law the law for privatization. Before that law, companies used to be like public agencies, like parts of the government and so on, and there was no separation between ministries and companies in that respect. So that law was introduced so that you start to have a structure for these companies. So it changed the companies from being government units into actually corporations or companies. I'll just give some very quick highlights of this law. SOEs are controlled by boards of directors and not by public servants. They have no preferential treatment. So from that day, they are dealt just like the private sector. They have no legal immunity. Before that, it was impossible to take a public sector company to court. You had no chance of doing this. But after this law, they just treated like any other company. You can take them to court and you can sue them and everything. The law grouped these companies, instead of having them as product entities, under holding companies and then affiliated companies, so that they are in a better economic structure. The governance structure, which is outlined in this law, makes sure that there is a very strong connection between the holding company and its affiliates in that respect. So the holding company has a General Assembly, which is appointed by the Prime Minister. It also has a Board of Directors appointed by the Prime Minister based on recommendations from the relevant ministers. And the Board of Directors of the holding is at the same time is the GA of all its affiliated companies. So the connection is there. So the Board of the holding is at the same time the owner of the affiliated entities. So actually, so they are on each board to make sure that there is some sort of harmony and coordination. Half of the board, which is what I talked about lightly in the morning, half of the board of SOEs is elected by employees. So usually they come from the employees, usually low-ranking sort of employees, and the other half is appointed by the owner. So there is no space for independent directors. Half of them is appointed by the owner, half of them elected by employees. But they have to prepare budgets based on the Egyptian financial accounting standards, which are very similar to the international financial standards, and they are audited by the Central Audit Agency. It's actually a very strict and very independent auditor. Now, I want you to pay attention to this coming slide on the Code of Corporate Governance for SOEs. This is really a very important lesson that we can all learn, which again answers the OECD principles. What we did is we started drafting our Code of Corporate Governance for SOEs, and I was the head of the committee doing it. We started first by the OECD principles. In 2005, they issued a document calling Corporate Governance for State-Owned Assets. So we started from this document, translated it into Arabic, and we have plenty of working groups from the Egyptian experts in governance, legal experts, public sector experts, and so on, to read the OECD principles and to change it so that actually it's matching with our own culture and laws and regulations. So we reached at this sort of draft based on the OECD, but amended in the Egyptian context. And then we retranslated back this into English, and we sent it to the IFC, the Global Corporate Governance Forum, the OECD, who read the draft and gave us their comments as well. And we changed again accordingly. So by the end of the day, what we have is we have an Egyptian code in the Arabic language based on the OECD principles, but again, tailored for the Egyptian context in that respect. And it is actually classified in 6 groups. I will not talk about these groups in detail. I have them already on CDs. If you like, I have the code actually on CDs, if you like to see the code itself. But there are 6 groups. The first one is talking again about what we said this morning, the legal framework for these companies, and that they have to have the proper framework. Second group is regulations setting the state as an owner, what it can and what it cannot do as an owner of these companies. And then the third chapter talks about the treatment of shareholders, fourth about the stakeholders in general, and then transparency, disclosure, and board of directors. Again, I have all the codes on CDs for those who are interested. Now, The key philosophy behind the code was, despite that we have a law for these companies which has some sort of information about the governance, it lacked lots of details. So the idea was we have to have some sort of detailed discussions about certain things which are not in the law itself, such as the framework issues of corporate governance for SOEs, such as the ownership objectives and what they should be and how can you be transparent about them, how to connect to the management, shareholders, stakeholders, and so on. That was not in the law itself. So that was actually detailed in the Code of Corporate Governance. What was more important is, after the code itself, once you have the code, you have to try to train people on how to apply the code, which was a big issue. Because the code is very nice, when you read it, it's very interesting, but then how to apply this is a different story. And that's where we started to have massive campaigns of awareness and capacity building of directors in these companies. So 50% of our trainees are actually from leaders and boards of state-owned enterprises, which was very important. So now they can apply what we have been teaching them to apply. Now, some of these courses, we intentionally give them with the private sector on the same room. So we get directors from the public sector and the private sector together so that they start to see how things are being done in large Egyptian private sector companies and banks. But then other courses are very specialized for them, so we get them together so that we teach them how to apply what's in the code and what is the value of applying these things to them. Now, that was very interesting because some companies start to come to us later saying, look, we'd like to improve our overall practices, so come to our company, evaluate the system, and give us recommendations and a plan for improvement, which means we were able to encourage the appetite of corporate governance in these companies. Now, the results that we have are actually very interesting. Every single state-owned enterprise now has a website in Arabic and English. It has the minimum information of the financial statements, Arabic and English, as well as the ownership structure, and that's the minimum. We give recommendations for much more information to be disclosed. So you see a variety of disclosure patterns, but again, you have the minimum information there. Most of them have audit committees controlled by majority of non-executive directors from companies, and they have audit reports and so on. More interestingly is because of what happened in the governance and management of these companies, they used to make losses of 2 billion Egyptian pounds in 2004. Last year, they made 5 billion pounds of profits, and we expect more actually this year. So in fact, the sort of professional boards of directors, along with the interaction with the management and disclosure, really put pressure on these companies. And what helped, I have to say this, is sometimes some of the directors of these companies were taken to court and jailed because of mispractices. So they start to feel it's serious. It's not really about just being a board member. It's really, there is responsibility involved in the process. Now, the last thing I will say is something called the ownership unit. It's a recommendation by the OECD and the World Bank that in every country you have to have one entity which represents the ownership of public sector companies. And we have been discussing this in Egypt in the last couple of years, and we agreed that we have an entity for ownership, which will be the owner of all the companies, so that you have one entity that represents the ownership of these companies. Of course, there is lots of politics involved, because what you are doing is you are taking power and money from ministries, put them in another entity, and so on. So there is discussion about it, but we do expect, we have next month parliamentary elections, we do expect this law to go into the parliament next year. However, I have to be honest, I suspect it will be as we planned it. We planned it to have the ownership of all the public sector companies. I think what will happen is they will say, let's have some companies under this entity and then others are out of that entity. The final slide I have is on the lessons that may be useful for somebody here. Now, the first thing is, in every country of the region that we went to, it's a unique country. They have their own laws and regulations and systems and so on. You can not have one set of rules and regulations for every country of the region for SOEs. So you have to be careful about this. However, the OECD does have a very good reference, a background that you can start with, a document that you can say, this is the foundation, and then we can build on it. But do not take it as is. It is not really suitable for us. And even in the OECD itself, they say this is the framework, and every country should take that and adopt it to its own conditions. So you do not take it as it is and just make it your code of corporate governance. Considerable awareness and capacity building is very important for the implementation. because if you don't have the right people, you will not be able to apply anything. It's very important to realize that you can never separate SOEs from the government, politically speaking. It's not going to happen. And we did have a meeting in Paris last year with SOEs from the developed countries, and they have the same issues. So the political intervention and all this, it does happen. It's just we have to be pragmatic about this. The separation will not really happen as long as the ownership is for the government itself. We talk about corporate governance for listed companies and banks. However, we cannot really underestimate the importance of corporate governance for SOEs. Again, because of the keyword I said at the beginning, market distortions. If you do not have governance in them, they distort the markets in which they are operating. Finally, of course, it's very important to have the right political commitment. If you don't have the ministerial and government approval on this, it's not going to happen. Because, again, it's about power and sharing power with somebody else. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening and welcome any questions. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you very much. Our next speaker is John Knight, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Mumtalakat, a public holding in Bahrain that I think has been engaged in some of the most interesting and innovative reform policies regarding the state-owned enterprise sector in the GCC in the last few years.
To start off with, Bahrain Mumtalakat is the country's investment arm. The law enabling the creation of Mumtalakat was passed in 2006, but then after a period of planning and implementation, I think the company had its first full year, fully staffed, 2 years ago. Our purpose is to increase the wealth of the country, and our assets consist of the non-oil and gas assets of the Kingdom of Bahrain. When we were created, we were given interest in 30 companies, and those companies had initially reported to their stakeholder, which was a different ministry in the country. So when we came on board, the countries had a different shareholder, and the shareholder was a commercial entity. We're formed under the Companies Act, so we're very different from a ministry. We have 30 different companies in our portfolio. 2 of them, Stefan mentioned earlier, I'm proud to say is leading state-owned companies in MENA. One is Alba, which is an aluminum smelter, and the other is Batelco, our telecoms company. So we were given 30 companies, all in the non-oil and gas sector, and for the first time these companies reported to us as a commercial shareholder. In terms of how we're governed, we have a board of directors, and the chairman of our board is the Minister of Finance. The deputy chairman is the CEO of the Economic Development Board. The other 7 board members are primarily from the private sector. 2 of them are CEOs of banks. Another is a principal in a large regional accounting firm. And then as a governance matter, our own board consists of 3 different committees. One is a compensation and governance committee. Another is an audit committee. A third is an investment committee. Similar committees at our executive level exist. We have an operating committee which focuses on risks and operations, which I happen to chair. We have an investment committee, and we have a corporate social responsibility committee. We are audited by the National Audit Court, but also we have outsourced our internal audit function to KPMG, and our external auditor is Ernst & Young. So we're heavily audited, and I think it's been very helpful to us. Our main strategy is to create a balanced portfolio of investments, and over time we anticipate will be 50% MENA, including, of course, Bahrain, but the other countries as well, and 50% global. And why we will maintain strategic stakes in companies that are important to the national interest. We don't feel as a general matter that we need to own 100% of any of these companies. We may now, but over time, that's not our philosophy. Let me point to 4 important initiatives we've taken just in the past year. The first is to be rated. We thought that we would get lower cost of capital and enjoy a greater degree of confidence by our banks if we were rated. So this year we were rated by Fitch and Standard & Poor's and equalized to the sovereign as a single A investment grade rating. We also did a bond deal to get long-term debt. We felt like we needed long-term capital because we have long-term assets, and we didn't want to rely on short-term funding, or for that matter, over the long-term floating interest rates. We're doing an IPO of Alba, which is our aluminum smelter, which will be listed on the London Stock Exchange and the Bahrain Stock Exchange. We're in the offering process now. If you're interested in purchasing shares, I'll refer you to the website and your investment counselor. But it's another step toward the privatization of an important asset. We'll remain a strategic shareholder, but we don't feel like we need to own 77% as we currently do. And finally, working with the directors we appoint, we're implementing the Bahrain Code of Corporate Governance, which was promulgated this year and will be law in January in all our portfolio companies. And I think with that summary, Stefan, I'll leave it at that, and then we'll be available for any questions that you may have after the fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am likely to later on abuse Chairman's privilege and ask you the first question. Our next speaker is Mr. Abdurrahman Al-Harthi, who is the Director General of the State Audit Institution of Oman. And he is currently in charge of the auditing of ministries in the Sultanate, but prior to this, he was responsible for the auditing of government companies and public authorities. So once again, we get a practitioner who's got another interesting story to tell that's quite dynamic and yet I think quite different from the Bahraini experience. Please, Mr. Abdurrahman.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be as short as possible so you can go for lunch, you know. As a Omani flavor, state-owned enterprises in Oman represent many sectors. And they constitute of oil and gas sector, telecommunication, electricity, industrial, commercial, and even investment. So with this different type of sectors, if I recall, there are about 70 to 80 state-owned enterprises in Oman. Most of those, 90% of those companies are owned by the Ministry of Finance as concern of ownership. So they report to the Ministry of Finance indirectly. The form of board of directors were a little bit different than the Bahrain system there. Each company have their own board of directors, which give it more independently and corporate governance to be enhanced there. So every company has its own board of directors. Board of directors are nominated by Minister of Finance. And the good thing is some of the board of directors were started in the state-owned enterprises are independent director. So the concept of independent director already there in the state-owned enterprises. If we recall in Oman, state-owned enterprises, they used to be part of some ministries historically, and they moved out, or they are part of public authority. So through years, there's a big reforms was done in the commercial sector in Oman and the companies. So most of those companies, they become under the act of the Commercial Companies Act. They work under that Commercial Companies Act. And they as well appoint auditor, external auditor through their AGM. As well, they are audited by the state audit institution, which is their oversight those state-owned enterprises. Many people think that state-owned enterprises are closed company and nobody knows anything about them. But I assure you that they are most of them, they are under the audit of state audit, and most of their report, they do produce annual reports. They are very transparent. They do, although they are not, although they are not, they have to comply with the corporate governance code of corporate governance code of listed companies, but they are voluntarily, most of them or 90% of them, they are following the code of corporate governance. Good news are we are working now in the National Committee for the Corporate Governance in Oman. We are almost in the final draft on issuing state-owned enterprises code of corporate governance. This will enhance more in the companies for government companies. This is a very short brief, and I'll wait for your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You see, we're bringing you rapidly closer to lunch. Our last speaker is Mr. Sertaç Keleş, who is yet another practitioner from, this time, Turkey, more specifically the Turkish Treasury, where he's the senior associate in the General Directorate of SOEs. Please, the floor is yours.
How do you do it? Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I'm going to tell you about what have we done and what we are aiming at for applying corporate governance principles on state-owned enterprises of Turkey. Here you see the presentation outline. I'm going to summarize the public enterprises in Turkey, the classification of public enterprises. And then I'm going to tell you about how we perform the general meetings and the election or appointment processes of board members. And I'm going to tell you about the recent progress of our work on state-owned enterprises. And then lastly, I'm going to tell you about the new draft SOE law that we are working on. In Turkey, there is no standard classification for public enterprises. There are a lot of categories they belong to. The first category is the treasury portfolio. There are two subgroups in treasury portfolio. One of them is the state-owned enterprises that are defined and restricted by law empowered decree number 233, which was published on 1984. And the second group is the state entities that have their own legislations. I'm going to tell you about the difference in the next slide. And then the second group is the privatization portfolio. These are the state companies that are going to be privatized. Some of them are still owned by 100% by the state. Some of them are partially privatized, but still the control or majority of the shares belong to state or the public institutions. And the third subgroup is the companies that are considered as privatized as the public share became to minority. And there is also a third group. These are the companies funded by some foundations, the local administrations, or other publicly owned institutions that do not fall into the treasury portfolio. And there are also some institutions that are not defined as companies, but they're dealing with commercial issues such as Turkish Radio and Television Company or the National Lottery Administration. In Turkey, if the state owns 100% of the company, then there is no general shareholders meeting, and the board members are not elected but appointed. In the SOEs, there are 6 members in the board. One of them is appointed by the minister in charge of treasury, and the remaining 5 of them are appointed by the ministry in charge of that sector. This actually creates a conflict of interest because the treasury exercises the ownership function on behalf of the state. However, the majority of the members are appointed by the ministry. Treasury cares more about the long-term performance and the financial performance of the company. On the other hand, the related ministry, of course, cares more about short-term goals and political and social policy. And in the second group, where the public owns less than 100%, the Turkish Trade and Commerce Code rules apply. So there is they do have general meetings, and the board members are elected. However, the result of the election is somehow predetermined by the minister, because the representatives of the state votes according to what minister dictates to them. So it's kind of appointment again. In that category, the statute and the voting right of the public representatives and the private company representatives are the same, except the ways they are receiving. The public representatives are already being paid by the state because of their full-time jobs, so only the weights are different, but other than that, they have equal rights. And there is a third group, the publicly owned banks. In 2001, Turkey experienced a huge financial crisis emanating from the banking sector, and then came the new Turkish banking law, which proved to be very successful in the latest global financial crisis. And that banking law came up with some restrictions and some conditions on the banks and the board members. So according to the banking code, even if the state owns 100% of the banks, a general meeting is going to be done. And there are some preconditions on executive board members. There are certain conditions in terms of their educational background or professional background. So to summarize the progress we have experienced on the SOEs in Turkey, the first model that came at 1984 was the SOE model. There is a common policy on all the public enterprises. They are restricted in terms of their budgeting, procurements, investments, recruitment policies. And unfortunately, this model lacks the responsibility and accountability principles of corporate governance, because the board members are appointed, but they don't have any responsibility on no real responsibility on the performance of the company, because there is no performance measure index, and they cannot be dismissed before their duty period, which is 3 years. Then we created some autonomous like SOEs, which had more autonomy in terms of investment spendings and budgeting. However, this model also lacked the accountability principle. Also, there is no performance measure index yet. And the political interference couldn't be avoided, because the board members had concerns about had concerns whether they are going to be reappointed or not. Also, the state companies are also audited by the Auditing Council of the Ministry. The Auditing Council of the Ministry has the authority to start investigation on the board members. So, for the sake of not to be investigated, the board members also are still dependent on the minister's mercy. The third model was applied for the public banks, as I told you in the previous slide, and they act just like private companies. And in this model, the board members are still independent. They cannot be dismissed, and they have full independence in their voting in the board meetings. However, we think that the independent board member model does not give the results that we are expecting. So we are preparing a new SOE law and a new trade law to satisfy this aim. The new SOE law that we are still working on is going to apply the corporate governance principles on the companies. There will be a performance measure index both on the board members and the managers. The independent external auditing will be mandatory for all state companies, and stakeholders, not only the shareholders, will be able to attend the general meetings. Of course, they will have no voting right or no access to the confidential information, but they will have a right to declare their opinions about the company in sake of transparency and equality. And for the public enterprises, the new draft trade and commerce code principles will also apply, which means all the companies, but the public companies, will have general meetings, and their board members will be elected just like the private companies. Here we are developing a new model in which the legal entities will be represented in the board. They will not have permanent board members, but a legal entity will be the member of the board. In this model, the legal entity which has shares in the company will have right to change their representative in the meetings, and the representative will vote on behalf of the legal entity that he is representing. This might sound a little bit strange because it's against the independency rule, but we think that it will bring more responsibility on the legal entity that has shares on the company, because in the current model, the related ministry or the related public institution appoints a member, but all the responsibility belongs to the member, not the public institution. However, from experience, from the current practice, we know that the members are not fully independent. They are only independent on paper, but the responsibility belongs to them. So it's hard to apply the accountability and responsibility principle on the public institution that is appointing the members. So in the new model, we are coming up with the idea that the public enterprises will have representatives, not appointed members in the company. So we can go into detail in the Q&A part. Thank you for your patience.
All right, thank you very much to all of the panelists. I think we've got a rich panoply of different experiences here, and I think all of those touched on the various ways in which issues of structuring boards, appointing boards, auditing and control structures, requirements on disclosure and transparency, different ways of structuring ownership have been solved in different cases. And I think this is the right point to ask the first question to the audience, which relates to exactly those issues. If we could just get that up on screen. What are the regional priorities to address and improving SOE governance? Is it about improving the selection of board members? Is it about introducing additional transparency and disclosure requirements? Is it about reviewing the ownership policy, streamlining the ownership forms, holdings, line ministries, or other special entities? Or is it about improving the control and audit environment? Now, I have strong views on that, but I'm not allowed to vote. But you have, I think, 10 seconds. If Nick could start the customary countdown.
I'll start counting. 10, 9, 8. While I'm counting, just so you know, the SOE corporate governance, the OECD SOE corporate governance principles are available in English and in Arabic. They are available on the website. We also have the CDs, and we also have the right outside for you, so you can pick up a copy. 3, 2, 1. Trying to be efficient with my time.
Okay, so we have a fairly even split between improving the selection of board members as the most important issue, improving the control and audit environment as the second most important one, and introducing additional transparency and disclosure requirements as the third issue that's given some weight. And people don't really seem to care very much about either aspects of the ownership policy, which is very interesting. But before I go on blathering out my own views about that, I think I should ask the panelists whether that reflects their own views and perhaps what their own priorities would be if they were allowed to vote. Any volunteers?
Here, I'll volunteer. I think it depends on the country and the SOE because they're all in different states of evolution. But in terms of our evolution, we think, just as the audience does, that the selection and induction and training of the board members is the most important thing. And indeed, the country does too, hence the effectiveness of the Code of Corporate Governance, which really emphasizes the director's role, becoming law in January.
Thank you. Yeah, Ashraf, please.
Well, I think from my point of view, number 3 would be very important because from discussions in Egypt and in the region, you don't really see a clear policy of the ownership. I mean, why would you like to own this company? In the case of Egypt, we do have companies which are working in textiles, for example, production of bed sheets, which are owned by the government. So the policy of why you own or should not own is not there. So I think we start with this, the ownership policy, and then the rest will fall in place.
Right. So I think in the interest of time, we should move right on to the second and last question, which is structured in a much more straightforward way, and that is, should SOEs adhere to similar corporate governance guidelines as listed companies? Yes, no, or maybe. And if your answer is don't know, then I think you should also choose maybe. And I think we've had some implicit discussion of that in some of the presentations where it was mentioned that SOE corporate governance standards were actually adjusted relative to those that are used in the private sector. But please, you have 10 seconds. Nick?
Yes, I'll start counting. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Well, that is a very clear verdict. The vast majority, 4/5 of people, are in favor of applying the same corporate governance guidelines. I personally might have chosen option 2 if I had been allowed to vote. But I'd like to solicit some views from the panel. I think Mr. Abdurrahman wants to comment.
I agree with the first one, 90%. Yes, we need, but I would like to add something. Already in Oman, state-owned enterprises, the voluntarily following the Code of Corporate Governance for the public, for the listed companies. So we need only very few issues because of the culture here and the other things, and the uniqueness of those state-owned enterprises. So we're already following that, the corporate governance. So for you, I'm not talking on behalf of state-owned enterprises of the government, but from my personal experience, I say 90% of state-owned enterprises, they're following the Code of Corporate Governance.
Yes, Ashraf, please.
Again, it's back to the concept of distortion of the markets. I mean, look from the market point of view. If you are in a market and then you have companies owned by the government and by the private sector, but they are under different sort of corporate governance provisions, this will be some sort of mixing in the market. So I do believe on the answer is yes, because so that we have equal footage in the market.
John, please.
Just one footnote on that. I think if the SOE wants to be rated or to issue bonds or retain the confidence of his banks, it would be a very good idea to have corporate governance along the lines, at least as required by the various listed companies.
All right, thank you. I think now is the point to ask Nick, our stern taskmaster, how much time we have left for audience questions.
Sure. Yeah, it is between the next panel and lunch. So we're going to try to make sure we're all disciplined here. We only have 5 minutes left, and then the next session will be 45 minutes. So we're going to go to lunch at 2:30 for those that are keeping track. So any questions? Please identify yourself.
This is Al-Walid Al-Sanani, Corporate Governance Officer, Saudi Arabia. My question is addressed to Mr. Ashraf. Would a comprehensive corporate governance regulation would serve the state-owned enterprises requirements? I mean, why do we have to have two sets of regulations if a governmental-owned company listed on the market? Would that be seen as over-regulation? Would that be seen as making things difficult for companies owned by the government to comply? A comprehensive corporate governance regulation might be a solution. What do you think?
The first thing I have to say is regulation is not the answer. In corporate governance, we always say it's important to convey the importance of corporate governance, the value added for the shareholders, the stakeholders, and the society. So regulation itself is not really the answer in corporate governance. Otherwise, you get into the box-ticking sort of mechanism, saying I have an audit committee, I have independent directors, but actually all this is only on paper. Now, it's not a matter of complicating the market. The matter is when you have a different owner, in this case, the state, and for example, if you have a company which is 100% owned by the state, as the owner, if they see corporate governance in a certain way, then you have to respect that. And if this, as in our cases, you have large number of your companies are owned by the state, and the state has its vision about corporate governance, how they'd like to structure boards and so on, then be it, this will happen. So it's a matter of respecting differences between different companies. But the key threat is, again, it's in the market itself. So as long as these differences will not affect other stakeholders, so whatever the regulation that you have for, say, SOEs as compared to the private sector companies, you still have protection of shareholder rights, stakeholders, appreciation for responsibility of the company in the society, and so on, then there is no problem. The problem will happen is if you have different sort of ways of giving advantages to certain groups at the expense of other groups. So it may be a must sometimes. It's much better, of course, if you have one single regulation, but sometimes that's a little bit difficult because of the ownership or structure of companies. I hope I answered your question.
Very briefly introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Merjanis. I'm working in the securities regulator in Greece. I would like to make only a short comment. The comment has to do with the fact that SOEs have two special features which we need to take into consideration. First, Stakeholders includes both shareholders and the citizens of the country, and therefore the issue of accountability is very important in this respect because it involves political issues. And the second point I would like to make is that SOEs necessarily do not operate under fully private sector criteria because they have to have an ownership function as well as be subject to sectoral industrial policies that pay attention to employment and pricing and all these things for the sake of the people. Therefore, two issues need to be and adjusted.
He said corporate governance structure needs to be properly adjusted.
Yes, very briefly.
Yes, just one thing briefly to add to this is simply a unique situation in SOEs is the fact that the owner is the government and the regulator as well. So there is some sort of overlapping rules which you really in corporate governance have to address. To prevent the government from misusing the fact it owns certain companies and to do whatever it wants. So the separation of roles is really very important in SOEs, which is not the case in private sector companies.
Yes, I mean certainly the issue of the ownership policy is one that doesn't pose itself on the same level of complexity with private companies, because state-owned companies are usually state-owned or should be state-owned for a reason. They should be more than just. They should be in the game for more than just maximizing profit. And to clarify that, you need a more complex process of clarifying the long-term aims and targets of the owner. That's inevitably political and needs to be as transparent as possible, given that it's going to be a more messy process with more principles than in private sector companies. I think we can take one last question.
Given that many of the state-owned enterprises are not listed, therefore not accountable to the market, what sort of role can the state audit institutions play? I view them as potentially playing a role in overall audit, not just simply the financial audit that might come from the Ministry of Finance. And therefore, I'd like some comment from the panel on the role of state audit institutions, because they could play potentially a very important role in terms of reporting on performance, effectiveness, corporate governance, and other aspects of state-owned enterprises.
Very valuable question. As far as state audit, as I said before, the state audit, they play a very oversight role, not just in auditing as external auditor, but even we are challenging the board of directors resolution, which is we go beyond than any normal external auditor's function or internal audit. So one of the issues is challenging that overall of the board of director policies. That's itself. It is we are very independent, and we are far from that board of directors. So we play a very oversight in many issues. We make sure that every performance, economy, efficiency of the company is improving over there. So internal control system is done. We are completely independent as a state audit. We are not influenced by any sort of director. So, and we report directly to the government, first of all to His Majesty as annual report, and to the Cabinet of Ministers. In brief.
Yes, if I may abuse Chairman's privilege at last and add the last comment, I think one important challenge is performance auditing in a policy sense, because historically in the region, the state auditors have checked that the numbers add up, and they've been quite good at that, and that's what they've been trained on, and what they still do in most cases. What's more critical and what's been developed, but what still needs further development, is the capacity to substantively evaluate state-owned companies according to the non-financial performance, the performance on the indicators that are defined in the ownership policy. So things like employment, regional development, equity, environmental issues. And that, I think, is an area in which most of the auditing institutions in the region still have some way to go. and where it's all the more important to look at some of the best practice cases. I'd like you all to join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you very much.
We can start clapping now.
Thank you very much, sirs.